Good afternoon. Whoa, they're bright. Okay, I'm Ismail Malik, founder at Blockchain Lab, and I also run the ICO Crowd magazine and network. It's largely Asia-based. We're the fastest growing network in Asia. This presentation is largely to resolve some problems we had in the growth of the ecosystem in Asia and who we were trying to target. Okay, so I'm going to talk about how we're going to start to move towards a DAO economy, why we need a DAO economy, and how the token economy fits in there. Okay, so just to get a sort of quick indication from those in the room, how many of you are familiar with 3 or more tokens on that list there? Okay, right. So what we've started to see is, for the first time in history, a rapid emergence between having token symbolism and having adoption, right? So you can instantly see it, and you know, how many are actually familiar with, say, more than 10 in that picture? Okay, right. So, so in a little over 5 years, most of those tokens haven't been around for more than 5 years. We're having sort of mass recognition of tokens, right? If I was to ask a lot more tougher question, which would be, how many are familiar with what the underlying technology and what it's going to offer the consumers and how to access those networks for more than 5 tokens? Right, so we have a massive mismatch between token appreciation, what the token is, what its ticker symbol is, more importantly, what its icon, what its graphics are. But we may even know on CoinMarketCap its valuation if we check in daily, like most people currently doing. But what the underlying technology does, how it does it, and where it does it is largely absent, right? I can't actually see the back of the audience, right? So the lights are really bright. So. So where are we heading with it? So we've got 3 different revolutions taking place. On one side, we've got, which has sort of been going on for about 15 years, is the machine-to-machine evolution, right? So we've got transactions being taken place from machine to machine. Largely, this was the domain of mobile operators, and they were investing tens of millions of dollars and you know, long, extensive projects on how to create an economy between a single machine to another machine. What we're largely seeing now is this has been replaced. This has been replaced by tokens, right? So tokens are fungible, more transparent. You can have them running on a blockchain. So you're taking out the proprietary silos that used to exist in machine-to-machine architecture, and you're starting to see a massive shift towards this tokens on machines. And then at the same time, we've seen this massive revolution, growth spurts that we haven't seen, and investment cycles that sort of are compounding year on year in autonomous systems. Right? So we've got from autonomous vacuums, we've got self-driving cars. So we've really now started to see a real ecosystem around autonomous systems built up. We've started to see machine-to-machine architecture starting to be actually needed. So for the first time, we've actually got real use cases where the token economy can add significant value. Right? One of the examples I cite is if you've got a car and you've got an in-car entertainment system and you've got an in-car payment system, and you need to then go through a toll booth, you know, it's much more efficient and friction-free if you can just have a token that pays that toll booth. If you want to charge that car, if you want to go into the charge point, you're not going to flip out another card or wanting to pay on that. You should have an e-charge token to actually fit that in. So the reason we're putting this in context is you're seeing this proliferation of ICOs and token generation events, and a lot of these are looking abstract. There's no underlying basis on why we're having these token events, right? However, if you start to look at the larger ecosystem, what you want to look at is where are they going to fit in the infrastructure? If we're moving towards an autonomous and a machine-to-machine infrastructure, where are these tokens going to embed themselves? And that's where the real magic starts to lie, right? So what you're going to start to see is what we call Generation 3. So if we look at Generation 3 sort of autonomous systems, and one of those we're playing around with is if you look at Uber, the sort of one amongst many points, but one of the key factors that made Uber a success is what used to be traditionally in the taxi industry was an RTB call, right? So an RTB call was you drop a passenger and you return to base, right? So there was this whole part of the journey that was wasted. What you have now with autonomous and token infrastructure is you can have the drone pick up, drop a package, and then go off and do another delivery, right? In order to do that, that drone, and if you want it fungible and that drone to not be proprietary to one system, you're going to need to have some sort of backbone architecture which rewards and charges. So that drone essentially would drop onto a charge station, it would pay a token off for that charge station, and then go off to the next. It would take a delivery from a delivery service that would pay its token for delivering that token. So you can start to see swarms of autonomous systems that sort of embed themselves on top of this token architecture. And you're going to start to see a lot more tokens addressing the autonomous system. Right. We're all familiar with the blockchains, right? So, they do the same sort of, you've heard it probably in several presentations, so I'm not going to go into deep details. The underlying core basis of a successful consensus architecture and a blockchain is how much efficiency does it drive at the core, and is there cost efficiencies in running and operating that token architecture, right? Therefore, you have sort of two schools of thought. One is a proprietary private ledger like Ripple, where you can scale and have a significant amount of transactions, but you lose some of the social and transparency around it, and obviously you're all familiar with Bitcoin on the other end of it that has high levels of security but doesn't have the transaction throughput. Right, so we started to play around with what would an architecture be, and actually the beauty is in a decentralized autonomous future, you'll start to see what we call DAO chains. These would be chains which reach out to multiple DAOs, right? So it would be a DAO network which has pointers, and it reaches out and it says, okay, you now need to access a DAO for ICOs, you now need to access a DAO. And essentially, what you can have is a future where what we call autonomous cash. The autonomous cash will sit in a DAO wallet, and it can push and pull payments that are relevant to that moment, right? So it will take your location amongst other data. It can run its own AI algorithms and say, okay, you're now at a charging point. We will now take your e-charge token to charge. And you're now moving through a toll booth. You're now needing to take a stream a song. So we go onto a streaming service and take a token off there. In that context is where the actual token economy and all these multiple token generation events actually start to make a real sense, right? It's in that token economy where you've got a Web3, you've got a internet of tokens essentially, right? The internet of tokens exists. That allows for it to be pushing forward, right? So you move from phase one, where you just have ledgers, so relatively dumb ledgers, just stores your balance. You move to phase two, where you have smart contracts and some logic on the ledgers. And now so the current research and the excitement is where you're moving to phase three, where you now have autonomous systems and autonomous cash which can access the internet of tokens, know what's the best token, most appropriate token to run on there. I mean, a lot of you are familiar with DEXs, right? So you have decentralized exchanges. The exciting thing with decentralized exchanges is you can swap. If you don't have that particular token in your wallet, on your ecosystem, you can atomically swap it for another token to be put in there near real time, right? There's moves around it. Neo has Nex, and you have AirSwap, you have Ether Delta. How many are actually familiar with Ether Delta in the room, just so I get an idea, right? So I would recommend start looking at some of these 3.0 architectures that are starting to emerge, like Ether Delta and you know, so essentially what you'll start to see is you'll move away from having that first graph where you picture where you had multiple tokens, right? You had tens and hundreds and hundreds of tokens. Current coin market cap, if you look, we're nearing 1,500 tokens, right? So there's no real sense that we're going to be able to scroll through 1,500 tokens and move around that. You'll start to see tokens and services much like you start to see now, and they'll be all boxed in there, and those will be the tokens that we use for that service at that time. So essentially you would have your one wallet, which if you're going on and checking on an airline, currently you still have to key in your airline miles, you have to do it, you know, the fungibility in those air miles are quite abstract. But within a DAO system, it will take your, we've just experimented with Cyber Miles tokens, it will take your Cyber Miles token, and when you actually go to duty free, or you come out and you want to buy Starbucks, it will swap it around and put them into merchant tokens, right? Same for transport, same from VPN, computing services. We're playing with a very interesting system at the moment called Social House, where the entire house can have an autonomous architecture built into it, and all participants can embed themselves into the DAO, so right from your smart heating, from your bills, from your entire sort of lifestyle, you can have it encompassed in one bracket. You know, so think of it like Airbnb, but you know, really like 10 years from what potentially Airbnb does, right? Airbnb, you just book it, you pay it, it's very friction. You know, it's way beyond what we had 10 years ago, but still, you know, you go there and you may not have this, you want to order some takeout from there, you want to access your VPN, you want to look at the services, you know, all of those add-on services and all those functionalities absent from it. But in something like Social House on a DAO network, you'll actually have the ability to access a whole range of services just from the click, because the AI is actually, you know, sitting on the blockchain, and it's actually told you, right, you're in that house and this is all the tokens you've got in your wallet, this is what we can open up as services. One of the things that DAOs are doing is looking at replacing the entire contractor model, right? So if we look at 99% of all services, at some form or another, there's a contractor. If we're starting to look into the sharing economy, the gig economy, and its rise, you're some form of contract to do a job. Currently, that's a very asymmetrical relationship, right? It just goes to a platform like Fiverr or Upwork or one of these platforms, Mechanical Turk, and you sort of bid. It just comes out. There's no real aggregation, right? So DAOs are going to allow aggregation for multiple contractor platforms to be able to go into one, and the DAO can select and do according to your needs and requirements and your token holdings, what is the best contractor for you to have. And I can go in much deeper detail, but I mean, in the interest of time, I'm running out. But you know, you can start to put some real clever logic and defined payment structures into that contractor model that actually, over time, starts to learn on what your contractual habits are. Right? I'll do one there. Right? So why is this revolution happening? Because we've already had a previous revolution, right, which is still run. We've had an open source revolution. This has allowed for millions and millions of lines of code to be made available, right? A public source that is now all been, we're just working in a project in Korea where we put an entire open source library into an XML format, and we're starting to import this onto blockchains and starting to create dApps and smart contracts from this. So you're starting to see the importation of potentially billions of lines of code coming onto the blockchain, right? The key sticking point and the friction point DAOs have is, over time, DAOs diminish the need for a sovereign state, right? So a sovereign state and the services it offers, and for the DAO to go back to a sovereign state is going to be a friction point. So if you look at so you will start to see this friction between what you have now, like the first iterations of DAOs in the decentralized exchanges and centralized exchanges, right? So because the moment you start to put significant amounts of KYC layer and other forms of packets on top, you actually put bloat on the network, right? If you want to take the bloat away and you want to actually scale these networks, you want to have just what was the core code and the core smart contract on there without the bloated added necessities. We are working with a project called CoinFirm, which, if you're familiar with it whitelists and blacklists coins to see if they've gone through the dark net, which may be a halfway measure to sort of ease up government regulation on DAOs and their future. So you're going to start to see a lot more ICOs starting to have DAO-like operations where they'll be autonomously have code, and if you meet certain metrics, like the DICO, as Vitalik has sort of extensively discussed, can sort of release amounts and have sort of rewards and incentive models. You'll have academies, anywhere you need to have some sort of autonomous system that can take away the friction, are open to have a really strong DAO architecture put in there. Lounges, members lounges, traditionally you sort of subscribe to them, you go and use them. They largely can sort of start to benefit from some of these autonomous architectures, right? What's the future? So the future is where AI DAOs start to sort of interact autonomously with real-world assets, right? One of the examples we're playing with now in the lab is we've got a lot of people suffer in capital cities from particulates, right? Particulates are tiny particles that go in your body and very hard to take out, and probably the largest cause of stroke now currently in the planet. So we've got sensors which are autonomous. Those sensors are paid by a small token for the user that wants to check how much particulates are in that zone at that current time, right? Whether they should avoid that zone. Those tokens then sit on that sensor, and that sensor is self-sustaining. After a certain amount of tokens, it's able to pay for its electric, it's able to pay for its upkeep, and over time it can replenish itself, right? So over 3 years, it can have enough tokens to repurchase itself and have another reinstall and upgrade itself. So you can start to see a massive proliferation in IoT devices as these DAO networks expand, right? Where it really gets interesting, and some of the early experiments in Stanford and some of the other labs that are really looking into this in a deeper sense, is where DAOs are learning off DAOs, right? So you have a DAO and you have a network of DAOs that learn and start to take best practice from each other to actually start to create a much more efficient layer of DAO architecture, right? So the big question I get asked is, well, fine, what's the remaining role for human beings, right? After we have these DAOs and they autonomously do everything, what do we do? What we found is that actually there's a large need to have oracleized calls, right? So oracleized calls is where the DAO calls out to a set of defined humans or parameters, and it asks the human, what do you feel of this governance decision? What input can you give? Is it a philosophical statement? A whole host of questions that DAOs are unable to answer. These are sent out, and these are called oracleized calls. So we're actually seeing a massive rise in demand from DAOs having to call out to oracles. So, humans are going to be sitting in the center of DAOs in the human-in-the-loop model, where they answer and fit and solve the most difficult problems when the DAO isn't able to answer it, or the DAOs. And these oracleized calls, so there is going to be an entire new job category of what essentially oracles who feed back into DAOs, right? One of the models we're looking at DAOs is looking at how do we actually rapidly increase the utility from ICOs, right? Because there's an actual need for the DAO to perform, it has a requirement, has a user base. So utility tokens in ICOs are not just this SEC type of arbitrary, is it a security, is it a utility? DAOs are one of the practical needs for having tokens that actually have a utility on the network, right? So this is just fun. You're likely to start to see DAO lounges. More and more people start to get involved in the DAO industry and wanting to actually share ideas on how to improve their DAOs. This is just a pun we had. We had a Daoist, revolution about 3,000 years ago, where we sort of advanced thinking in humans, and now we're starting to see the re-emergence of groups of people coming together and looking at designing autonomous systems. So that's pretty much it. I'm on Telegram. I don't usually put my last slide with my details, but at Ishmalik, I-S-H-M-A-L-I-K, if you want to speak to me. I'm going to be around for the rest of the day. I would urge for you to not look at DAOs with a very 2.0 lens, but look at this as a completely new autonomous architecture which brings real life and utility into tokens. So I know the previous speaker, there's a whole discussion around ICOs are a bubble and, is there room for growth and what. This is just the tip of the iceberg, right? If it can be tokenized, it will be tokenized. We're going to have an internet of tokens. It will be interoperable, and there is a definite need to have more tokens. So don't be put off if there is an idea that you feel that can be tokenized and you want to do a token generation event for it. You are still at, the very sort of 0 to 1 stage. We've still got another millennium of experimentation in the tokenized future. Really appreciate your time, and please find me later if you need to ask any more. Thank you.